In an absolutely shocking and celebrated announcement today, we have learned that Julian Assange, controversial founder of WikiLeaks, is set to be released from prison after agreeing to plead guilty to one count of violations of the Espionage Act. And in this announcement, many are asking, should we be celebrating or should we be terrified? Because for the first time in the 100-year history of the Espionage Act, a journalist has been forced to plead guilty and serve years of prison time for doing what journalists are expected to do. Let's get into it. In a saga that has spanned 14 years, multiple continents, countries, administrations, embassies, and prisons, today brought to an abrupt end what many have called the journalistic fight for freedom all across the globe. Going all the way back to the beginning, in 2006, Julian Assange was an Australian computer scientist who founded WikiLeaks with the intent and purpose of using the internet as a force for good to help whistleblowers to bring corrupt information, dangerous information, dark information to light out into the public eye, not only to provide protection for the whistleblowers, but also to ensure that the public gained access to information that governments and maybe just multinational corporations would otherwise seek to classify, suppress, censor, or otherwise make disappear. It was in 2009 and 2010 that Julian Assange drew the ire of the U.S. government and the administrations at the time. In these videos, he brought to light a series of actions that were taken on behalf of the U.S. government. The 2010 leaks were known as the collateral murder logs, and in these leaks, it detailed and exposed a series of actions taken by the U.S. government and our military during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, many of which were considered possible war crimes and led ultimately to the death of a Reuters photographer. These led to international conversations about accountability and whether or not more transparency was needed during times of war and crisis. It was at this point that the U.S. sought the extradition of Julian Assange from Sweden, and he ended up fleeing bail and taking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he ended up being stuck for 7 years. It was during the 2010 leaks that Julian Assange gained international notoriety and began working with mainstream news sources like the New York Times. It also became clear to the U.S. government during this period that he had leakers from within the government that were leaking him the information he was publishing. And as a result, the U.S. government began what was ultimately a hunt for the people leaking U.S. secrets. During this time, the Obama administration started their efforts to see if they could somehow indict Julian Assange without damaging freedom of the press under the U.S. Constitution. As Julian Assange continued to hide in the Ecuadorian embassy, leaks continued to come out via WikiLeaks as he had servers across the globe, and as fast as they could try to take them down in one country, they would continue to be posted from another. It was in 2016, during his period of seclusion in the Ecuadorian embassy, that the DNC election email leak was posted. Now, these detailed a series of hundreds or thousands of emails between the Democratic National Committee, John Podesta, the campaign chairman for Hillary Clinton, and a number of other high-ranking DNC officials that clearly showed that the DNC was working with the Clinton campaign to help her to succeed and to deny Bernie Sanders a fair opportunity to run for election in the United States. These emails led to significant controversy during the election, and many people or voters within the DNC became outraged and actually ultimately filed a lawsuit against the DNC. Many have claimed that these leaks ultimately contributed to the successful election of Donald Trump during the 2016 election. It's because so many people state that the WikiLeaks email leak from 2016 led to Donald Trump's election that it was so shocking when in 2019 there was an accidental leak showing that the Trump administration and his Department of Justice had ultimately quietly and confidentially indicted Julian Assange for the leaks going all the way back to 2010. After the leak of the information that he had been indicted, the Department of Justice added an additional 17 charges for violations of the Espionage Act. This marked the first time that any journalist had ever been indicted for a violation of the Espionage Act for doing what journalists do, bringing corrupt information to light and to the American public and the world. At this point, Julian was forced out of the Ecuadorian embassy and was immediately taken into custody by the British government as an ally of the U.S., and he was locked up in a maximum security Belmarsh prison, where he has been every day since. From 2020 to 2021, a British judge ruled that Julian Assange could not be extradited to the United States. However, the U.S. Justice Department appealed that decision and ultimately won in 2022, where it was announced that he would be set to be extradited to the U.S. to stand trial for 17 counts of violations of the American Espionage Act. Over the past decade, dozens of organizations have advocated heavily for the release of Julian Assange, with every group from Amnesty International and Reporters Without Borders to the Freedom Federation and Julian Assange's own family members, coupled with the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Courage Foundation that provides legal support and advocacy for whistleblowers worldwide. The Australian government has also sought the release of Julian Assange. But throughout all of that, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have stood steadfast, refusing to drop the charges, which could have been done at any point. Both could have also issued pardons, which both refused to do. While there can be no question that the allies advocating for Julian Assange's release have something to celebrate today in his finally being released from prison after this 14-year saga, there comes a question, at what cost? And I think even Julian Assange would say the cost was far too high. Because for the first time in the 100-year history of the Espionage Act in America, a journalist has now been forced to plead guilty after being charged with 17 counts under the Espionage Act for doing what journalists are supposed to do, for seeking out sources, bringing information to light, bringing corruption to light, and then later protecting those sources, which is entirely in accordance with the history of journalism in America. So while yes, today we are celebrating the release of Julian Assange, all journalists are going to experience a chilling effect after this, wondering if every time they have a source come to them with important information that needs to be brought to light, they'll be the next Julian Assange set up to be charged with crimes under the Espionage Act for doing what journalists are supposed to do and bring corruption from within our government and abroad to light. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and we work together to fight private equity, to save small businesses in our community, and to defend the First Amendment.